This is the City of Idaho Falls Erosion and Sediment Control online training. My name is Angie Gilman, and my company is called Engineering with a Mission. My colleague Adam Lyman with Simon LLC and I created this presentation. There will be a test at the end of this presentation, so follow along and take notes. So why are you here today? The EPA created the Clean Water Act in part to make sure that our rivers and lakes are fishable and swimmable. Seems like a pretty good idea, doesn't it? The other reason you're here is because it's the law. The city of Idaho Falls is required to do their part to minimize the polluting of stormwater discharges into the Snake River. Because you're working in the city limits, you're required to abide by these rules as they pertain to construction. Failure of the city to meet these requirements is a violation of federal law. Our goals and objectives for today are for you to understand what we can do to minimize the impacts of construction on water quality, understand the requirements of the City of Idaho Falls, the State of Idaho, and the EPA, and to learn about BMPs, or Best Management Practices for Construction, your tools for doing your part. So why is water quality important? When sediment load increases in a river, the water temperature increases. As that water temperature increases, aquatic plants die, aquatic insects decrease, leaving less food for fish. And high temperatures also mean that certain species of fish can no longer thrive or survive. It also makes recreation less enjoyable. There are countless uses for clean water. It's important that we do our part to try and keep our lakes and rivers clean. So what does this have to do with you? Well, construction is the leading cause of sediment runoff in urban areas. Under the EPA's Clean Water Act is the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. The NPDES is over stormwater management for 3 different sectors: construction, industrial, and municipal. The municipal separate storm sewer system is a sector that applies to the City of Idaho Falls because the city discharges stormwater to the Snake River. When you're working within the City of Idaho Falls, you're required to comply with the city's Erosion and Sediment Control Ordinance. The purpose of the City of Idaho Falls Erosion Control Ordinance is to protect stormwater, groundwater, water bodies, water courses, and wetlands from construction activities pursuant to and consistent with the United States Clean Water Act. Their goal is to manage and control the amount of pollutants in stormwater discharges, soil erosion, sediment discharges, mud and dirt deposits on public roads caused by or the result of construction activities. The City of Idaho Falls erosion control application must be submitted to the Department of Public Works for commercial or multifamily projects. This application must include proof of an erosion sediment control contractor certification, and you must obtain approval of your erosion control plan. For single-family residential projects, your erosion control application must be submitted to the building department. Your project's erosion and sediment control best management practices, or BMPs, will be inspected during the foundation inspection. The City of Idaho Falls requirements are that no clearing shall commence until all erosion and sediment control BMPs have been installed. Notify the building department or the Public Works Department at least 2 working days before the start of construction at the installation of your BMPs, completion of final grading, and close of construction or final landscaping. The city requires that all sites greater than 30 acres be constructed in phases. Those phases are established at the plat review period and are approved by the city engineer. If a project is constructed in phases, you must install your BMPs for each phase prior to beginning work on that phase. All erosion and sediment control BMPs shall meet the design criteria as set forth in the BMP manual for Idaho cities and counties that was published by the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. You can go to your nearest Idaho Department of Environmental Quality office to obtain a hard copy of this manual, or you can go to their website to download a digital copy. In addition to using this manual, always refer to the manufacturer's installation instructions for the specific products that you purchase to use. The Idaho Department of Environmental Quality has jurisdiction over air quality for the entire state of Idaho. Fugitive dust from construction is considered air pollution and is therefore regulated by the Department of Environmental Quality. There are consequences for non-compliance. Failure to reasonably control fugitive dust on your job site may result in enforcement action by the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. Enforcement action can include monetary penalties. The Idaho Department of Environmental Quality has oversight over air quality for the entire state of Idaho. Fugitive dust from construction is considered air pollution and is regulated by the Department of Environmental Quality. Failure to reasonably control fugitive dust may result in enforcement action by the Department of Environmental Quality. This enforcement can include monetary fines. As we mentioned before, the EPA's Clean Water Act includes coverage over stormwater from construction activities through the Construction General Permit. The EPA's coverage through the Construction General Permit is for any construction project that disturbs more than 1 acre or more. It also applies to smaller projects that are part of a larger common plan of development. An example of a larger common plan of development would be a subdivision. If your project falls under the requirements of the Construction General Permit, a Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, or SWIP, is required. A SWIP should be provided to you if it's needed. If it's not and you know it's needed, don't start work until one is prepared by a qualified plan designer. The SWIP must be submitted to the EPA via a Notice of Intent 14 days prior to construction. The SWIP document must be kept on site at all times. This is applicable inside and outside the city limits. Your stormwater pollution prevention plan will include a very detailed written document. It will also have site maps, drawings, and inspection forms. Self-inspection is required once every 7 days or every 14 days and after a 1/4 inch of rain event. You must keep your completed self-inspection forms on site at all times in the event that the EPA decides to visit your site. These forms are legal documents and are very, very important and must be kept on site for the duration of your project. During your self-inspections, you'll be evaluating your BMPs to see if they need maintenance, replacement, and whether or not they need to be changed out. Maintenance consists of cleaning and minor repairs to BMPs. Replacement is necessary if a BMP has been damaged beyond repair or if it wasn't ever installed properly. If you see that a BMP is insufficient to perform as anticipated, additional BMPs may need to be added or the BMP be replaced entirely with a different one. Your stormwater pollution prevention plan requirements will be very specific as far as stabilization. All bare soil areas must be covered either with hard surfaces, landscaping, or native vegetation. Examples of hard surfaces include buildings, concrete, and asphalt. Perennial vegetation, such as grasses, must be reestablished to at least 70% of the normal local vegetative cover. There cannot be any large bare areas remaining. You must continue to do inspection until you achieve final stabilization. If your project requires dewatering and you're dewatering to surface water, the EPA requires turbidity monitoring to be done. Turbidity is a measure of the level of sediment that's in the water. You'll need to take a turbidity reading of the receiving water directly upstream of the project, as well as right where you're discharging into that receiving water, and compare the two readings. The water discharging from your site must be within 50 NTUs of the receiving water's turbidity measurement. These measurements must be recorded and kept on site for the EPA to inspect. If you don't feel like you or your staff are qualified to complete the turbidity monitoring, there are testing companies for hire that can do this for you. At the end of your project, you must terminate coverage under the construction general permit. In order to do that, you need to remove all equipment and potential pollutants from your site. You need to remove all BMPs not intended to be permanent or intended to decompose in place. You need to achieve final stabilization of your site. And finally, you must get online and file a Notice of Termination, or NOT, at the EPA's website. Okay, we've completed talking about the federal, state, and local requirements. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about the best management practices that you're going to need to incorporate on your project. So just what are BMPs, or best management practices? BMPs are the methods, measures, or practices used to prevent or reduce water pollution, including but not limited to structural and non-structural controls, operation and maintenance procedures, other requirements, scheduling, and the distribution of your construction activities. The different classes of BMPs include erosion control, sediment control, run-on and runoff control, housekeeping and materials management, planning and project management, and post-construction BMPs. So before we talk about them, let's talk about why we need BMPs. We need BMPs because of erosion. Erosion is the detachment and movement of soil material by the action of water or wind. We have BMPs because we have erosion. Erosion leads to sediment that gets into our stormwater, that gets into our surface waters. So our goal on construction sites is to stop erosion from happening in the first place. The types of erosions that we deal with include splash erosion, which comes from raindrops, sheet erosion, rill erosion, which leads to gully erosion, and then channel erosion. If we can keep erosion from happening in the first place, then we'll spend a lot less time cleaning up sediment around and near our job site for the duration of the project. Erosion control is our first line of defense. If we can keep soil from moving in the first place, then we don't have to clean it up someplace else. Our goal is to prevent water from running across our exposed slopes and surfaces as much as possible, and to try and keep soil in place. If we don't have erosion, then we don't have to clean up sediment someplace else. This is a case of an ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure. So what factors influence erosion? Soil erodibility is a huge one. Silts and fine sands are very erodible, and we have a lot of them in Idaho, whereas clays and heavy gravels are not as erodible. Vegetative cover is another big one. Good vegetative cover provides protection from erosion through roots holding the soil in place, as well as the plants themselves protecting the soil from raindrop erosion. Plants also slow down the velocity of water as it flows over the ground. Reducing the velocity limits how much power the water has to pick up soil particles. Topography is an obvious one. The flatter, the shorter the slope is, the less likely it is to see significant erosion, where longer, steeper ones are much more vulnerable. Climate determines how much precipitation a project site will see. Areas with high annual rainfall are much more susceptible to erosion than arid regions. And finally, season. Regardless of where your project is, constructing it during winter months will definitely impact how much erosion you will need to account for during your project. Now we're going to cover the erosion controls that you might use on your project. The first one will be preserving vegetation. We'll go over slope tracking and slope roughening. We'll talk about mats and blankets and mulching. The number one thing that you can do to minimize erosion on your project is to preserve vegetation. Preserving vegetation is a free BMP. It slows down the velocity of the water, the roots help hold soil in place, and it also helps reduce raindrop erosion. Best thing you can do is limit your exposed soils by preserving existing vegetation. Use construction fence to provide protection for areas where you want to preserve existing vegetation. This will go a long way in reducing the amount of sediment runoff from your site. The EPA's construction general permit requires a 50-foot separation from any surface waters such as lakes, rivers, or wetlands, and any ground disturbing activity from construction. Use construction fence to maintain that 50-foot buffer between your project and any surface water. Next is slope tracking or soil roughening. The purpose of this is to hold the soil in place by firming it down. It also helps trap the seeds in the little grooves that are created from the tracks. Also, the roughening from the tracks reduces the flow velocity of the water as it runs over it. Some of the maintenance issues to consider or making sure that you do your slope roughening when you know that there isn't rain in the forecast. Additionally, it's really critical that the soil roughening or the tracking be done up and down the slope and not parallel to the slope. Mats and blankets are another erosion control BMP. The purpose of the mats and blankets is to do temporary stabilization of your slopes. They help to establish vegetation by protecting the seeds as they germinate. They also come in a variety of types, thicknesses, and specifications. Some erosion control mats and blankets are meant to last for 12 months, while others are intended to last up to 3 years. So make sure you get the blanket that's appropriate for your intended use. The key to mats and blankets being effective is proper installation. Seed beds need to be prepared prior to the mats being installed. The mats must be installed from the top down the slope. The mats need to be staked in well all along the slope, and the mats need to be overlapped sufficiently so that there aren't gaps between them. And the most critical is that the mats need to have a really good contact with the soil. So the slopes need to be graded prior to the mats being placed. If there are holes or large lumps in the slopes, then the mats, wherever those are, is where soil erosion will take place. One nice feature about mats and blankets is that they generally are intended to be left in place. As grasses become established, the mats and blankets will decompose and no longer be visible. Mulching is another highly effective erosion control BMP. Prepare the seed bed prior to applying the mulch. Make sure that you apply the mulch in more than one direction so that there aren't thin spots or shadowy spots. Also, make sure you check the forecast and don't apply within 24 hours of a rain event. Mulching is generally effective for slopes that are steeper than 3:1. It's really important that you apply the appropriate amount of mulch and tackifier. More mulch might be required on steeper slopes, while flatter slopes may not need as much mulch. Mulching can be initiated immediately after final stabilization or final grading of your surface areas. Make sure that you complete your stabilization of your bare areas within 14 calendar days per the EPA's Construction General Permit. Also, make sure you inspect and maintain those mulched areas, those stabilized areas, until they have completely been stabilized. That's the end of our erosion control BMPs. Now we're going to move on to sediment control BMPs. But first, the definition of sediment. Sediment is eroded material suspended in wind or water. It's suspended material that is being moved from its original location. Make sure you understand the difference between erosion and sediment, as there will be a test question about this at the end. Sediment control BMPs include stabilizing your construction entrance, fiber rolls and straw wattles, silt fence, check dams, and inlet and outlet protection. Relative to erosion control BMPs, sediment control BMPs are generally about 50% effective. Erosion control BMPs are more likely to be 90% effective. Therefore, erosion control BMPs should be your first line of defense. A stabilized construction entrance is a non-negotiable. You must have this on all of your projects. A good construction entrance is way less expensive than sweeping track out every single day. Your stabilized entrance needs to consist of 2 to 4 inch clean crushed rock. The depth of it needs to be approximately 6 inches. The width needs to be 20 feet and the length into your project needs to be 50 feet, allowing for tire rotations, multiple tire rotations on the gravel to remove the dirt. At times you may need to replenish the gravel for that construction entrance as it will get clogged up depending on how much moisture you have in your soil type. Rumble strips are another tool you can use to help stabilize your construction entrance and reduce and eliminate soil and sediment from getting out onto your surface streets and into the storm drain. If you do have track out at your construction project, you must sweep and clean up that track out the same day that it happens. Fiber rolls or straw wattles are an extremely versatile tool for sediment control. Their primary function is to slow down water and to trap sediment. They can be used for perimeter control, as shown in this picture. They can also be used along the toe of hillsides, as well as along contours of hillsides. Again, always make sure that you install fiber rolls along the contour. Make sure you overlap them sufficiently at the ends where they meet. Make sure you have very good contact with the soil for the entire length of the roll, and make sure that it's staked down properly, typically every 4 feet. Maintenance issues associated with fiber rolls and straw wattles include the fact that they're not very durable. They will need to be replaced if they get broken. Additionally, you'll need to muck out any sediment buildup on the back side of them if there's a storm event. After a rain event, go and inspect your hillside that you installed your straw wattles on. If you see rills or gullies that have formed between your rows of straw wattle, immediately fill them. Otherwise, they'll just get worse over time. Silt fence is probably one of the most common sediment control BMPs used. Silt fence works by ponding water and allowing sediment to settle out. Silt fence is good for use at the bottom of large exposed slopes, as well as as a barrier around the bottom of stockpiles. Silt fence should never be used in high concentrated flows. It is intended to pond water. Silt fence is absolutely useless if it's installed improperly. It must be trenched in as shown in this diagram to the right. The stakes have to be installed on the downhill side. Additionally, it must be maintained. As sediment builds up behind it, it must be cleaned out in order for it to continue to be effective. Check dams are an excellent sediment control BMP to be used in ditches and swales. The primary purpose of check dams is to slow down the velocity of the water while ponding the sediment behind the check dams. The check dam on the bottom left is working really well, as evident by how much sediment is deposited upstream of the check dam. But it needs to be cleaned out. Like all BMPs, check dams work best when they're maintained properly. Again, proper installation is key for the effectiveness of check dams. The elevation of the toe of the upstream check dams need to match the elevation of the top of the downstream check dam. Also, the center of the check dam needs to be lower than the sides. Otherwise, water will quickly find a path along the sides and erode them. Inlet protection devices are the last chance to stop sediment before it goes into the storm drain system and enters the Snake River. Again, the primary purpose of this BMP is to slow down the velocity of the water and settle out sediment. A variety of options are available for inlet protection, including coconut fiber mats, similar to the one shown up in the right-hand corner, rock-filled bags, as shown on the bottom right, and inlet devices, as shown below. Inlet protection devices must be maintained either by cleaning them regularly or replacing them regularly. Unmaintained inlet protection devices can get clogged up and cause major flooding issues around your site during storm events. Inlet and outlet protection is another important sediment control BMP. Again, the primary function, as similar to other BMPs, is to slow down the velocity of the water and to let the sediment settle out. Use clean, angular rock for your riprap. Make sure that it's wide enough to collect all of the sediment that it needs to. The length will depend on the slope and the soil conditions. The last sediment control BMP we're going to cover is runoff and runoff control. Before your project starts, go out to the site and take a look and see what your surrounding conditions are. Do you need to put a berm around the upstream edge of it to divert water from running onto your site? Conversely, look at where your site drains off and see whether or not you need to put some sort of berm or straw wattle or other form of BMP to keep runoff from leaving the site. Now we're going to move on to our next class of BMPs, which is housekeeping or materials management. This group includes debris containment, dust management, storage and proper disposal of toxic materials, and stockpile management. Managing your debris is key to keeping a job site clean. Make sure you size your debris containers properly and have them emptied on a regular basis. Clean up the area around the containers frequently. The new construction general permit states that all containers will be covered when not in use. This may seem impractical, but it is the requirement. So do your best to have some way to cover your container when it's not in use. Dust management is really critical for our job sites. Why is dust regulated? We have a lot of very fine silt particles in Idaho. Those silt particles are comprised of silica or glass. So the dust in our air is basically fine, tiny, sharp pieces of glass, which is extremely hazardous. As those fine particles are inhaled, they penetrate deep into lungs, causing lung diseases. They can affect people with impaired lungs as well. Not only is it a health risk, but it's also an air quality issue, and it's a nuisance. Dust management BMPs include stabilizing your roads, watering your exposed areas, preserving existing vegetation, sweeping, managing your stockpile, and saw cutting using water and a vacuum. Storage and proper disposal of toxic material is an important part of good housekeeping for your job site. Before your project starts, consider what sorts of toxic chemicals you might have on your project, including fertilizers, paints, oils, etc. Make sure you have provisions for storing these things properly. You'll need to be in a watertight container and covered. If for some reason you do need to do maintenance on a piece of equipment on a job site, use drip pans or lay down a sheet of Visqueen underneath that piece of equipment. If you do have a spill, make sure you clean up all of that spill immediately. Having a spill prevention kit on site is part of what you're going to need to have if you have toxic chemicals on your site. A spill prevention kit can be purchased at a local construction supply store, or you can purchase a bucket and a shovel and a big bag of cat litter, which is primarily made of clay and is a great absorbent for toxic chemicals. A concrete washout is required by the Construction General Permit. Concrete washout is extremely toxic to aquatic life and cannot reach the storm drain inlets or waters of the US. Make sure you create that washout with the leak-proof liner. Properly size your concrete washout for the amount of concrete work that you expect to have on your job. And make sure that it's cleaned out on a regular basis and signed well so that the concrete contractor knows where it is. Washout of any kind must be contained, whether it's from stucco, paint, mortar, caulk, drywall, whatever, and any spills must be cleaned up immediately. Your job site porta potty should be staked down to protect it from vandals. Don't place it near a storm drain or a curb and gutter, or in a place where it could be tipped over easily. Again, keep a spill prevention kit on site and avoid vehicle fueling and maintenance if at all possible. And finally, sweep that construction entrance daily. And finally, stockpile management. If your stockpile is not going to be used for 14 days, it must be stabilized. It can be done through a variety of methods, ranging from covering it with Visqueen to seeding it or covering it with a tackifier, but it must be protected. Also, consider where you're going to place that stockpile before you start construction to make sure that it's out of the pathway of any kind of stormwater runoff that could cause erosion and sediment. Planning and phasing includes limiting exposed soil as well as proper scheduling of dewatering. When you're beginning to work your project, consider how you might phase the clearing and grubbing portion, trying to minimize the exposed soil at any one time. Consider scheduling your excavation during dry months if at all possible, and make sure that it gets stabilized prior to the rainy season. If you do need to do dewatering, make sure you have an approved dewatering plan in your erosion and sediment control document, as well as your SWIP document. Plan this activity carefully. Try to do it when groundwater levels are their lowest to minimize the amount that you need to dewater. Here's an example of a site preparation checklist you could use to make sure that you have all your basic B&P bases covered before you start your projects. It's most likely that one of your post-construction B&Ps will be revegetation, as you'll probably have some bare areas around your site once your construction is done. You really want to have successful revegetation the first time so that you don't have to come back and do it again in the future. Here's some tips for successful revegetation of your site. Save your excavated topsoil from the rough grading phase and use it for revegetation. Scarify that soil to increase water absorption and seed germination. Seed and soil contact is essential. Your planting techniques will make a difference as to whether or not you have successful revegetation. Site-specific plants are also really beneficial and will increase your chances of long-term success. Consider adding soil amendments or fertilizers to improve your soil structure if needed. Consider also using supplementary irrigation if you're going to be revegetating during the dry season. You may need to use an herbicide to prevent excessive weeds prior to your vegetation getting established. Look around your site at the property around it and see whether or not excessive weeds are an issue. And finally, consider applying mulch to protect your germinating plants, or consider using an erosion control blanket if you have really steep slopes. As your project comes to a close, here's a simple site final checklist that you can use for yourself to make sure that all your erosion and sediment control items are complete. As you can see, all B&Ps are not created equal. You'll need to tailor the B&Ps you use to fit the conditions of each project. Keep in mind that it's your responsibility to keep your B&Ps maintained and in good working condition. It's also your responsibility to change B&Ps if a particular one is proving to not be effective. Remember, keeping stormwater that leaves our construction sites as clean as possible before it reaches the waters of the U.S. is our responsibility. Well, you've made it to the end. We've covered what we can do to minimize the impacts of construction on water quality. We've looked at the requirements of the City of Idaho Falls, the State of Idaho, as well as the EPA. And we've reviewed B&Ps and their specific applications that you can use on your particular job site. I hope you feel better equipped to do erosion and sediment control on your projects. Thank you, and best of luck on your test.